Series called Thriving in Babylon, and we want to learn how to not just survive the land we live in, but how do we thrive in the times that we live in. And I want to welcome you guys. My name's Tim. How's everybody doing? Morning's worship was awesome. It was awesome to get God's presence, and my prayer is always that our hearts are ready, right? And if you're a guest, welcome. You came at the perfect time, right at the beginning of a series, so you get to join us for the whole series, right? That's how it works. You signed up. You didn't know it, but yeah, I'm just kidding. And those of you I've been waiting for this series all summer. Like I've been waiting to be able to preach what I'm about to preach this morning to unite us. Because honestly, have you ever felt like you've gone to bed one day and then woke up the next and it seemed like the world was completely different? Have you ever felt that? Like it's kind of like, what's going on the planet? What's going on in this world? What's going on in our country? And the thing is, our culture changes so fast, doesn't it? Like technology is continually growing and changing, which changes how we communicate, and there's a new app to communicate with all the time, and you have to figure out, oh, I just got used to texting, now I got to do what, and then you got to move on to the next thing, and so communication is continually and constantly changing on how we talk to each other, and with all these changes comes a change in our culture, because then the culture grows up and responds to whatever's happening, and then it also changes the speed of just change in some other areas that in the past weren't norms, but now they are norms in our country or society, whether it's morality or whether it's just personal preference. And so we get into these seasons, right, where it seems like, what in the world is going on? And it's been interesting to watch, because in our country, there's been some pretty, I would say, drastic changes. But I need you guys to understand something. There's absolutely nothing new under the sun. There's not. So many countries, cultures, societies have come and gone through ups and downs and sideways, have been really godly and have been ungodly and anywhere in between. And the thing that's interesting is that the problem is this just happens to be the one that we're experiencing, right? This happens to be the time in history that God placed us on this planet. And it's funny, I love, maybe I don't love it, okay. I enjoy sometimes watching how Christians respond to culture, because some of them are just crazy, right? You know what I'm talking about? Like, I just have a good time just kind of laughing, but sometimes I just get ticked off too. Like, I really don't get mad at the world all that much, because they never signed up for what I signed up for. They're not a Christian. And so for me to think they're going to live morally like me is a little bit ridiculous. But anyways, so when you have all this stuff that happens in the country, you have changes, whether they're political, whether they're social, whether they're moral, whether whatever. There's kind of three responses I see Christians typically take when it comes to situations that they feel like are a little out of control. The first one is the sky is falling syndrome. You guys know that person, right? Like, oh my gosh, Jesus is coming back tomorrow. The sky is falling, right? Armageddon and blah, blah, blah. And they're always thinking tomorrow's the day. The world's going to blow up. The sun's going to throw a solar flare, and then Jesus is coming back. And they're continually living in stress, man. I couldn't live like that. I would need a lot of medication, right, to survive that kind of response to every horrible situation. Because then what they do is they research more about all these conspiracy theories, and they're like, oh, but you don't know the whole truth, and then they're telling you what the real truth is, and you're like, but I don't even care because I'm going to get coffee later, right? And so you have the sky is falling kind of Christian response to culture, like, what is going on, and that kind of thing. Then you have the oh, well, whatever syndrome in churches, where it's kind of like, well, the culture's shifting, and, well, we used to believe this, but now we're kind of with the culture. We're going to believe this now. And they kind of have the we'll just go with whatever kind of syndrome, which is kind of like, times change, and I don't want to seem archaic and like old school, and so we'll just kind of change with it. And so they just start wandering away from things that when I look at the scriptures, I don't see God really changing all that much. He's not a schizophrenic God. He knows who he is. But you have Christians that respond kind of that way. I'm just going to flow with culture and how it goes. Then you have, this is the third category, I'd throw some churches and some Christians in, it's the circle up the wagons. In the old times, in the old West, if they were being attacked by Indians out west, they would circle up the wagons so they could create a defense. They'd protect themselves, and so they had this kind of like let's all get in and let's protect ourselves, and then from time to time they would shoot back at the people who are trying to attack them. And so I see Christians doing that in culture. Whenever they feel attacked, they circle up the wagons and say, everybody huddle in. they're against us, and so let's start throwing grenades at them, right? Whether they're political grenades or religious grenades or whatever it might be, and they go on the attack then and actually build this great huge wall because they're circling up their wagons to the world they're actually trying to save, but it doesn't seem like they're doing that good of a job. So those are the three typical responses, and maybe for some of you in the room, you're in one of those three camps. Maybe when life gets hard or when you think things are a little out of whack in culture, you respond maybe in one of those three ways, but I'm going to suggest there's a better way. I'm going to suggest there's actually a more biblical way to view change in culture and how to not just survive, but to actually thrive, to actually succeed, to actually make impact. And we're going to learn from Daniel. Now, this whole series, the reason I've been so excited to do it is because it's changed the way I view current circumstances in our country. There's this guy by the name of Dr. Larry Osborne, and he is a pastor at North Coast Church in the wacky land of San Diego, California, okay? And he's one of those guys that's been in ministry for 30-something years at the same church, and he's led, and he's kind of a sage of the faith and just a lot of wisdom. My wife and I got to meet him and hear him at a Converge conference in Pennsylvania this last summer. In June. Converge is the conference of churches that we belong to and that we're connected to. And so it's just a few hundred of us and Larry teaching and preaching. And he brought this message, Thriving in Babylon, which I had heard one time before, but when I heard it this time, it was like an aha light bulb moment that I wanted to walk our whole church through it. So I need you to know some of the things we're going to be teaching, they're straight from Scripture, and then I'm also using his book, which is called Thriving in Babylon. If you want to go buy a copy and get ahead in the sermons, go for it. You're allowed to cheat, just so you know, when it comes to finding out truth and learning instruction. So you can go read the book if you want, and then you can come and take notes and see how wrong I was in different things. But I wanted us to learn this, and I'm actually going to go deeper into the three keys of how to thrive in our Babylon, in the culture that we live in, then even the book or even those kind of things go through. But this morning, I want us to learn first, which is kind of storytelling by this guy by the name of Daniel. So if you have your Bibles with you, and I would encourage you, each week, bring your Bibles, whether it's on your phone or it's an app or you got, you're old school and you open something and it has paper in it and you can write in it and stuff. Bring your Bible with you. If you don't have a Bible, we always have them in these baskets, and they are free for you. Grab one, put your name in it, take it home. We want you to have a copy of the Scriptures. We're going to read the entire chapter of Daniel 1 this morning. And what we want to do when we're reading it is we want to pull out some truths to help us understand maybe how we can respond in the culture that we live in. Now, maybe some of you grew up in church. We got some Sunday school folks in the house, right? You can have counseling later. It's fine. I grew up in the church, right, with the flannel graph and the storytelling and the whole this is, Daniel, and this is the lion's den, and he didn't get eaten, that kind of thing. You guys remember these stories? It's interesting because you remember stories about Daniel, and the thing is, I don't want us to think of this like Sunday school or as maybe you've heard in the past as these are good kids' stories. Because when we're reading chapter 1, this isn't really a kid's story. This is for all of us, and we're going to mine out some truths that I think will really, really help us gain some perspective on where we are as a culture, maybe where you are personally, where you live in the middle of the culture, and how you can thrive in it. So if you're in Daniel 1 with me, say yes. Awesome. If you're not in Daniel 1 with me, say no. All right, I just want to see if anybody would do it. This is a test. All right, so let's go into Daniel chapter 1. I'll have it up here on the screens. You can read it. Let me set it up a little bit first, okay? So Daniel wrote the book of Daniel, and he wrote it later in his life, looking back at all that he had experienced. And so he's looking from the lens of what he had learned and what he experienced and how he saw God in the midst of all these circumstances. So part of Daniel is storytelling and part of it is prophecy. Part of Daniel is telling what's going to happen in the end times. And it's pretty interesting if you want to dig into that, but we're not going deep into the prophecy end. We're going more into Daniel's life, okay? And so Daniel 1, he's writing his own experience of what happened when Jerusalem, which was God's nation, is the Israelites, the Jews, what happened whenever God let something happen to their culture and to their city. And it's interesting the insight that he has. So let's dig into it. Daniel chapter 1, this is what it says, starting in verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, it's fun saying these names, by the way, Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. All right, real words. Nebuchadnezzar came to kick Jerusalem's butt. That's what happened, okay? He came in to take over Jerusalem, which was God's nation, and to take over Jehoiakim, king of Judah. That's a problem, right? If you think that's God's nation, shouldn't it be protected? Shouldn't God, take care of it? Well, they weren't really walking with God in this season. And so God, I would say they left God's protection when they left his law and his promises for them. And so here comes Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 2, and the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put it in the treasure house of his God. Okay, this is a big deal. This is a big deal. Because when you think about what this just said, sometimes we have God in a box, and we kind of paint our own picture of him. Well, Daniel, as he's looking back at this and he's writing this, he uses this phrase, and the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into whose hand? The enemy's hand. Who did it? The Lord. Wait a minute. I got some questions, right? I love reading scriptures because it makes you ask questions like, wait a minute, God, you were the one that was in charge of this whole thing that happened? Yeah, the Lord delivered the king in Jerusalem over to Nebuchadnezzar. And not only did the Lord allow this to happen in his permissive and his directive will, meaning he was directing the scene. God is never surprised by things. I need you to understand that. He's never surprised by circumstances, situations, historically or present day or in the future. Nothing surprises God. And so here he is giving his permissive will to let this happen so that his direct will, which is the redemption of Jerusalem, at some point later in the future can take place. And so here's the Lord allowing it to happen. And then he lets them, the Lord lets them take some of the articles from the temple of God and put it into where? The treasure house of Nebuchadnezzar's, lowercase g, not a real God. This is a big deal. Why is this a big deal? When you read about in the Old Testament the precious things of God or the sacred things of God that are in the temple, there's power in those things, in those items, in his temple, in the Lord's temple. In Joshua chapter, I think it's in chapter 7, there's the Israelites were taking over Jericho. Jericho was a big city. If you don't know the whole story, they marched around, boom, crumbled, and they took over the city, right? And this is what God said, when you win and have victory in that, everything that you plunder, everything that you take from that victory, bring it back and put it into my temple. See, from the very beginning, God set up this whole thing where he wants the first of everything. And that's where we still walk in today when we talk about tithing or giving back to God. It's giving God the first because that is blessed. God desires the first and the best from our lives. And so he said, set aside all those things and put them into the temple. Well, there's this guy by the name of Achan. And Achan said, there's so much plunder, there's so much gold and all this stuff. I'm just going to take a little bit of it and take it back for me. And so Achan goes and he takes it for himself. Well, they go then to take over another city in the promised land, the land that God promised them. And it was a smaller city called Ai. And as they're taking it over, all of a sudden, they are rerouted. And actually, they get taken over. 30 of the Israelites' men get killed, and they retreat. And now here's Joshua saying, what just happened? Why did we lose this battle? And God revealed it to them that somebody had taken from what was his out of Jericho. Here's what I understand. Now, that whole story makes you ask a bunch of other questions, right? Like, why did 30 men have to die? Why did God just not let them have victory? It's not a big deal. This is what I know about God, especially in the Old Testament, and he's still the same God today. You don't mess with God's stuff. That's a big deal. You don't mess with God's stuff. I mean, there was this scene where the Ark of the Covenant, which was the presence of God inside of it, when they moved around in their tents, there was this one scene where they were carrying it and it lost balance, and one of the guys just leaned over to catch it because it was falling, and he died instantly. Whoa. You don't mess with God's stuff. So the Lord, this is where it's interesting, the Lord delivered, and he also let some of these articles from the temple go then to a false god's temple to be worshiped by a godless king who is honestly damnable. What in the world is going on? Let's keep digging in, all right? Do I have you? You in with me? All right. All right. This is good stuff. Let's keep going. Verse 3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, that guy, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. So now, not only did they take some of the articles, now they're taking the best of the cream of the crop of the men, and now they're basically they're kidnapping them, and then bringing them into the king's service. This I love how, because Daniel wrote this, I love how he describes himself and his friends. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace, if I do not say so myself, right? It's funny, right? When you think about it, he's the one, right? Well, I was handsome, and I was smart, and of course they wanted me, But that's who he was. Basically, this godless king is now kidnapping the cream of the crop in Israel to serve now this godless king in his service. He was to teach them, this guy, right, to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. Now, it's interesting when we get here, because the language and the literature of Babylon in this day and age, do you know what the major literature and language was that they were going to be studying? It was the occult and astrology. That was the main curriculum for their study to then serve in the king's service. The occult and astrology. So imagine being Daniel. What do you do? How would you have responded in this circumstance? You can keep asking yourself that question as we keep reading. That's what it says now in verse 5. So this is what happened. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter into the king's service. So they're getting schooled, right, in these two main categories of the occult and astrology, so that they could then enter into the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So these 4 handsome guys, right, are going into the king's service. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar, that's how I pronounce it, Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego, or Tebedwigo. I know that you don't say it that way, but so now not only are they kidnapped, now they're being trained for 3 years in the occult and astrology, and now their names are being changed. Now, in this day and age, names were identity. I mean, your name described who you were. And parents, when they named their kids, it was a huge deal. It wasn't just like they looked online and said, that's a neat name, let's name them Flower Star, or something. Don't name your kid Flower Star, please. So their names were their identity. Daniel's name meant God is my judge. That's a pretty powerful name. God is my judge. And in this moment, the king changed his name to Belteshazzar, which in essence, when you look at the language, you look in Hebrew, you look in what that name means, it's Bel's servant, or prince. Bel is one of the false gods in Babylon. So his name was changed to God is my judge to now I'm going to serve this other god. It'd be like you getting kidnapped, thrown in a van, taken to some other country, and they say, yeah, your name was Christian, but now we're going to call you Satan's prince. How would you respond? All right. And the other guys got their names changed as well. But Daniel resolved, I love that word, but Daniel resolved. We're going to learn some really cool words over the next 4 weeks. Words like perseverance, endurance, faithfulness. We're going to learn words like obedience. And these words, if we understand them from the character and the heartbeat of Daniel, can change your life. So Daniel, he resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now, no, I'll just keep reading. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. Now I need you to understand. I would say in your Bibles right now, underline that phrase right there, okay? Now God had caused. This is the second time in the story that you see God doing something, up to something in the circumstance, right? So God had caused what? The official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord, the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Okay, this sounds like a legitimate argument, right? Like, if I'm the official, I'm like, I don't want to die because you're not eating, you know? So he's like, the king's going to have my head. So we see Daniel, and we see him first ask. We don't hear him demand. We don't hear him say, but I have rights. We don't hear, he asks. Then, after he said, I don't know, then Daniel said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, he said what? Say this word with me. Please, 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 please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. He says, then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. He doesn't demand. He doesn't say, this is what I believe, you have to let me do what I want, I've got rights, so like I'm not going to eat your food. The king can have your head. That's not what he does, right? He asks. And then he says, please, consider this. And then he says, test it. And if we look fine and we're done, then let us have our way. But if not, then that's fine. See, Daniel shows a huge amount of humility in a circumstance. We're going to unpack that over the next 4 weeks. Humility. What does that look like? So he agreed to this, right? And he tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. Now, you vegans in the room are like, yeah, right? Like, see, it's in the Bible. I like meat, so to each his own. Verse 16, so the guard took away their choice food and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. So they God showed up, God showed favor. Daniel showed humility, not demanding, not controlling, not blasting, but let's just see what happens. Let's just see what happens. And God worked it out in the end. Let's finish up this whole passage. Okay, verse 17. To these 4 young men, again, you want to underline this, God gave. This is the third time we see God interacting in the story, okay? You can underline that. To these 4 young men, who gave? God gave. That was an easy test. Let's try it again. These 4 men, who gave? God gave, right? God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. What did God give them understanding of? astrology and the occult. Wait a minute. That sounds backwards, right? It's like, no. It's like, shouldn't God just have only given them wisdom about the law and the Old Testament and what they had before them? Like, why would God give them knowledge and understanding of all the learning in Babylon? And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. Next level gift to Daniel. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 19, the king talked with them, and what happened? He found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. This is what I call thriving in Babylon. Circumstances that were beyond them, that the Lord was up to something. They were put in a service of a godless, damnable king who stole from God to worship gods who didn't really exist, and now trained, kidnapped men who were smart and put them in a circumstance where he had to learn things opposite of what they actually truly believed, and now they graduated as valedictorians in the class. There was none other that matched their wisdom. That's thriving. They had influence like none other in that time with the king. Because this is what it even says. Let's keep reading verse 20. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. It said, and Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Man, they were 10 times better than all the other crazies that learned about all the occult and astrology and all that kind of stuff. They were given wisdom upon wisdom. See, when we look at our lives and we look at the culture that we live in, it's interesting how we respond. It's interesting how Christians respond. Because when we look at Daniel's life, and we're going to unpack this over the next 4 weeks, these kind of key words, these 3 values, these 3 things that we need to understand. And when we look at our own lens, okay, so I'm going to start pulling out what we just learned about Daniel and pulling it into our own lives. When we look at Daniel's story, like his reality, how bad was Babylon? It was pretty bad. Like Babylon was pretty bad. It was a very godless nation. And it ruled with power. I mean, they were wealthy. The king ruled with a lot of power in that point in time in history. This point in Babylon's history, this is about 500 years before Jesus showed up on the planet, okay? So when we're thinking about the historical timeline, it was about 500 years before that. And we know Babylon is bad because it's still even mentioned in the New Testament. When you look and read into the book of Revelation, you see heaven's vernacular. When they talk about evil, they don't go back and mention Sodom and Gomorrah, or they don't mention Las Vegas, they don't mention any other place. When they say it in Revelation, I believe, let me look, so I'm sure it's Revelation 18, this whole passage unpacks what they're saying. Fallen, fallen is Babylon. Whenever like heaven starts calling the fallen and the worst Babylon, that Babylon must have been a pretty bad place. It doesn't exist anymore. How bad was Babylon? Pretty darn bad. Okay? How bad was Nebuchadnezzar? Well, when you think about Nebuchadnezzar and you think about his leadership, and I've already talked about this, the fact that he stole from God's storehouse and put it in his own house to worship a God that never really ever existed, he was a pretty bad king. He ruled with absolute authority. He was controlling. I mean, you heard how the official responded whenever Daniel requested, can we not eat that food? He was, no, if I upset the king is going to have my head. Whoa, right? Later on, we learn some other things about Nebuchadnezzar. But Nebuchadnezzar, pretty bad. When I look at our own culture, it's pretty interesting because I don't think we've ever in America had that kind of rule in our country, right? I don't know if it'll happen in the future. Who knows? I just know we don't have it that bad. You may even politically disagree with who's in charge, But here's what I know about God. God is in charge of who's in charge. God is not surprised by decisions made by who is in charge, and God is there. And so God was in charge even when Nebuchadnezzar was in charge. And so if we start lobbying or start throwing grenades because we think God's left our country or God's left this or that, and I'm like, God didn't go anywhere. He's still right where he's always been. Still right where he's always been. So in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, pretty bad. Pretty bad. But God's in charge of who's in charge. What about the culture in Babylon? Well, let's look at our culture a little bit. You know, where we're at in America right now, there's things changing at a rapid pace. You know, there's legislature, there's judgments made, you know, there's laws put into place, there's a lot of things happening, but when I look at our education system, I'm pretty sure that the key curriculum for our kids today isn't the occult and astrology. That hasn't been voted in yet, right? Like that's the key curriculum. And yet we act like God's out of the schools and God's not present, and I'm going to try to be careful, but I'm not going to be. So when you say God's out of the schools, what you're saying is none of those teachers believe in God, because there's teachers who are all on with God who are in those schools. And I would have to say, yeah, God's still in the school. Just because prayer legally or disappeared, or because this happens or that happens, when we react in a way that is reactionary, we're actually placing a theological belief into our lives that is false. When we look at the sovereignty of a holy and perfect God who loves and calls people into his presence, he is doing that in the middle right now of Iraq. He's doing that in the middle of China. He's doing that in the middle of every place on this planet. And yeah, he's doing that in America. He hasn't changed who he is. And so when we make political statements and we put our theology on politics, we're messing up. Right? Our culture really isn't as bad as what we think it is. Now, when they vote that we need to study occult and astrology as our main curriculum, I'll preach a different sermon. But maybe not, because maybe we still need to learn how to thrive in Babylon. Does that make sense? So much of our issues in our country is honestly a matter of perspective. And who are you allowing to give you perspective? All right, I'm preaching. And I hope it's hitting. How bad was the culture? It was pretty bad in Babylon. And what was Daniel's dilemma? What was Daniel's dilemma? He was thrown in a pretty crappy circumstance, wasn't he? Okay, the nation that Daniel was a part of was God's nation. It gets overthrown by a godless, damnable king, and then that king happens to like you because you're handsome, attractive, smart, and so he pulls and kidnaps you from the language that you know, from the nation that you know. Now you're pulled into this whole other nation of a language you have no idea what it is, and not only that, you're being forced to go to school to learn things that you don't even care about so that then you can serve the king who is actually against God and make him prosper in his role as king over Babylon. And yet, what happened with Daniel? He thrived. He had influence beyond anybody else because he thrived. I want us to learn how to have that kind of influence in the communities we live in the friends that we have, in the culture that we walk through. Because it's going to change. There's going to be a new issue tomorrow. There's going to be a new issue next week. And if we just jump back and forth by the waves of the world, we will never experience the sovereignty that God actually has in our lives. And I don't want you to miss it. I don't want to miss it. I don't want to miss it. So how did he thrive? These three words: hope, humility, and wisdom. He lived with a hope. And not just like a dead hope. And this is next week. We're going to unpack this word hope, because for us, it's completely different than the actual biblical hope that we need to have in our lives. Humility, and I already kind of unpacked that a little bit, but this whole idea of humility is, I think it's a lost word or idea in our country. Humility is. And then wisdom, knowing what to do, when to do it, and why you're going to do it. Wisdom. And so we're going to learn these three things, okay? Now this morning, I want you to understand one key thing. And I've already said it, and I want you to hear it. God is in charge of who's in charge. And he's never left his throne. He's seated where he's always been. And in that seat, here's the most beautiful thing. He wants to give every single one of us a living hope for now and for eternity. And through him alone, we can thrive beyond what we ever thought we possibly could in a culture that might even look a little bit like Babylon. Let me pray for you guys. God, I pray that you would teach us these three words, hope, humility, and wisdom, over the next few weeks, and that we would learn to walk into that, walk into your presence, God. Just teach us. Teach us. I want to give two quick challenges. The first one is this. If you're not a Christ follower, if you do not have a personal relationship with Jesus, I need to understand that is the hope of eternity. That's the hope of life for now and forever. And you can never earn your way to get to heaven. You can never be good enough, because even in our best days, we're still sinners. God knew it, and he sent his son, Jesus Christ, to climb down the ladder from heaven to pull us up into a relationship with him by sacrificing his son. God sacrificed his son Jesus on the cross to pay that debt for us. And this is what it says in 1 Peter 1:3. It says, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead." If you want a personal relationship with Jesus, today can be your day. And you can walk into that. I'm going to have the prayer team come up. And this morning we're actually going to respond, church family, by taking communion. Because the living hope we have is because of the cross, where Jesus paid it all for us. I'm going to have Brad come up and lead us in that moment of communion. And then after communion, I want the prayer team to be available up front on either side. And if you want to walk into that relationship with Jesus, I want you to come down. I just want you to pray with one of the prayer team members. And even if you have anything else in your life that you need freedom in and from, I would encourage you to come and experience God's presence in prayer this morning.